A routine flight turned nightmare. Marcus Steele, a 39-year-old veteran of the United States Army, was no stranger to high-pressure situations. After serving in conflict zones and navigating the complexities of military life, he thought he'd experienced it all. But nothing could have prepared him for what awaited him on Flight 187, a trip that was supposed to be a simple journey back home after a weekend military reunion. The reunion had been a breath of fresh air for Marcus. It wasn't often that he could reconnect with those who had shared in the trials and camaraderie of military service. As the weekend concluded, Marcus felt a sense of nostalgia mixed with exhaustion. He longed to get back home, sink into his favorite recliner, and enjoy the peace that his small suburban house offered. When Marcus arrived at the bustling airport, he was greeted by the familiar chaos of travelers rushing to gates, flight announcements echoing through the halls, and the hum of luggage wheels rolling across polished floors. Despite the noise, Marcus moved through the terminal with practiced efficiency, his calm demeanor a stark contrast to the flurry of activity around him. Years in the military had taught him patience and composure, qualities he held onto tightly. Boarding Flight 187, Marcus found his assigned seat near the middle of the plane, carefully stowed his carry-on in the overhead compartment, and settled in. As passengers continued to file in, he adjusted his seating position, taking a moment to stretch his legs and relax. He had no reason to suspect that this flight would be anything but ordinary. The plane was nearly full when Sarah Johnson, a flight attendant in her early 30s with sharp features and an air of authority, made her way down the aisle. She stopped near Marcus, her gaze falling on his carry-on bag. "Sir, could you make sure your bag is fully secured in the overhead compartment? It looks like it's sticking out a bit," she said, her tone professional but clipped. Marcus glanced up at the compartment. The bag was well within the confines of the bin, and nothing was obstructing the aisle. "It's already secure," he responded calmly. "But I'll double-check if that helps." He reached up and gave the bag a slight nudge, ensuring it was flush against the back wall of the compartment. "All set," he said with a polite smile. Sarah frowned but didn't say anything further. She turned and walked toward the front of the plane. Marcus shrugged, assuming the matter was resolved. He leaned back in his seat and closed his eyes, ready for the flight to begin. Minutes later, however, Sarah returned. Her expression was markedly less friendly. "Sir, I need you to cooperate. The bag needs to be properly secured, and you're holding up the boarding process." Marcus opened his eyes, confused. "Ma'am, the bag is secure. It's not obstructing anything." Her eyes narrowed. "I need you to comply, or we'll have to escalate this further." Passengers nearby began to shift uncomfortably, their conversations quieting as they watched the exchange. Marcus felt a knot form in his stomach. He'd always been respectful of authority, but this felt different, unnecessary, even confrontational. "I'm not trying to cause any trouble," Marcus said evenly. "I've done what you asked. If there's an issue, I'd like to understand it." Sarah's tone turned icy. "You're being uncooperative, sir. I'll have to notify security if this continues." The tension in the cabin became palpable. Passengers who had been quietly observing now exchanged uncertain glances. Marcus, feeling the weight of the stares, tried to diffuse the situation. "Ma'am, I assure you, I'm not being difficult. I just want to understand why this is escalating." But Sarah was already reaching for her radio. "We have a passenger refusing to comply," she announced tersely, requesting assistance at Gate 7. Marcus's jaw tightened. How had things spiraled so quickly? He hadn't raised his voice, hadn't disobeyed any reasonable request, yet he was being treated like a problem. His heart began to race as he realized the gravity of the situation. This was no longer about a simple misunderstanding. It was becoming something much larger. Within minutes, 2 uniformed officers appeared at the entrance of the plane. They exchanged words with Sarah before making their way down the aisle. The sight of them caused a ripple of murmurs among the passengers. Marcus sat up straight, his military training kicking in as he prepared to handle the situation calmly. "Sir, we need you to step off the plane," one of the officers said firmly. His tone brooked no argument. Marcus looked up at them, his expression a mix of confusion and frustration. "I'm sorry, but I don't understand what I've done wrong. Can someone explain?" The officer's response was curt. "You're disrupting the flight. Please come with us." Passengers gasped as the officers moved closer. Marcus, feeling both cornered and humiliated, raised his hands in a gesture of compliance. "I'm not resisting. I just want to get my bag before I go." But before he could retrieve it, one of the officers grabbed his arm, their grip firm and unyielding. The other officer positioned himself behind Marcus, cutting off any chance of retreat. The murmurs in the cabin grew louder, and several passengers pulled out their phones, recording the unfolding scene. "Let's go," the officer said, tugging at Marcus's arm. Marcus rose from his seat, his movements slow and deliberate. He looked around, searching the faces of the other passengers for any sign of support, but most avoided his gaze. A few whispered to each other, their expressions a mixture of shock and discomfort. As Marcus was led down the aisle, the cabin fell silent. The once bustling plane now felt like a courtroom, with Marcus in the spotlight. He couldn't shake the feeling of injustice burning in his chest. How had a simple flight turned into this? When the officers reached the plane's exit, Marcus cast one last glance over his shoulder. The expressions on the passengers' faces told a story of disbelief and silent protest, but no one spoke up. The door to the jet bridge closed behind him with a resounding finality, leaving Marcus to wonder how he had ended up here, and why. The weight of silence. As the cold air from the jet bridge replaced the stuffy warmth of the plane, Marcus Steele felt a strange combination of numbness and clarity. The confusion and disbelief that had gripped him moments earlier gave way to a flood of questions. What had just happened? How had a peaceful journey home turned into an encounter with uniformed officers dragging him off the plane? The officers remained stoic, guiding Marcus toward the gate area without offering a single word of explanation. Marcus scanned their faces for any hint of empathy, but their expressions were set in stone, their movements mechanical. It was clear this was just another routine task for them, a task devoid of humanity. Marcus's thoughts raced as he struggled to process the situation. He had faced intense situations before: combat zones, high-stakes missions, and the unrelenting pressure of military life. But this felt different. This wasn't a battle. It wasn't even a conflict he could comprehend. It was humiliation, plain and simple. Once they reached the terminal gate, one of the officers finally spoke. "Wait here," he said, gesturing to a set of metal chairs against the wall. Marcus complied, taking a seat. The officer stood nearby, arms crossed, while the other disappeared into the jet bridge. Passengers began to disembark from the plane, their faces a mixture of curiosity and unease. Some avoided looking in Marcus's direction entirely, while others offered fleeting glances, their expressions full of pity or judgment. He felt like a spectacle, a figure in a tableau of quiet shame. One passenger, an older man in a crisp business suit, hesitated as he walked past, his brow furrowed. And for a moment, it seemed like he might speak up, but he quickly shook his head and moved on. Marcus sighed, the weight of silence pressing down on him. The airport incident report. As the minutes dragged on, a uniformed airline representative approached Marcus. Her name tag read Cheryl, and her expression was a blend of professionalism and discomfort. She held a clipboard in one hand and a radio in the other. "Mr. Steele," she began, her voice measured, "I'm Cheryl, the airline's customer relations manager. We need to complete an incident report regarding what happened on the flight." Marcus looked up, his frustration barely contained. "Incident? I'm still trying to understand what the incident is. All I did was comply with the flight attendant's request. Next thing I know, I'm being dragged off the plane like a criminal." Cheryl shifted uneasily, clearly unprepared for such a direct response. "I understand your frustration, Mr. Steele, and we're going to investigate this thoroughly. but I need to ask you a few questions to document everything." Marcus hesitated, his instincts as a soldier telling him to remain cautious. "Fine. Ask your questions. Can you walk me through what happened?" Cheryl asked, her pen poised over the clipboard. Marcus recounted the events as calmly as he could, though the raw emotions of anger and disbelief occasionally slipped into his voice. He described the initial interaction with Sarah, the flight attendant, and how her tone had shifted from professional to hostile without any clear reason. He explained his efforts to remain cooperative and how, despite his attempts to de-escalate, the situation had spiraled out of control. Cheryl nodded, jotting down notes. "Thank you for sharing your side of the story. I'll make sure this is included in our internal review." Marcus leaned back, his voice hardening. "An internal review isn't enough. I want to know why I was singled out, why no one even tried to talk to me before calling the police." Cheryl faltered, her professional facade cracking for a brief moment. "I can't answer that right now, Mr. Steele, but I promise you, this will be looked into." The ripple effect. While Marcus sat in the terminal, the video of his removal from the plane began making its way to the internet. One of the passengers who had filmed the ordeal uploaded it to social media with the caption, "Black veteran dragged off plane for doing nothing. This is unacceptable." The video quickly gained traction, shared across platforms, and sparking heated debates in comment sections. Some viewers were outraged, condemning the airline and the police for their treatment of Marcus. Others, however, questioned the full story, asking what Marcus might have done to warrant such a response. Back in the terminal, Marcus was unaware of the storm brewing online. His thoughts remained focused on the immediate aftermath. The officers had yet to release him, and Cheryl had left to confer with her colleagues. He felt stranded, both physically and emotionally, caught in a system that seemed intent on reducing him to a case file. A soft voice interrupted his thoughts. "Excuse me, sir." Marcus looked up to see a young woman holding a smartphone. Her expression was a mix of hesitation and determination. "I was on the flight," she said. "I saw what happened, and I just wanted to say I'm sorry you had to go through that." Marcus blinked, momentarily taken aback. "Thank you. That means a lot." The woman glanced over her shoulder nervously. "I filmed part of it. If you need the video for anything, I can send it to you." Marcus felt a surge of gratitude. "I appreciate that. I might need it later." She nodded and quickly jotted down her contact information on a scrap of paper before hurrying away. It was a small gesture, but it reminded Marcus that not everyone was willing to stay silent. The release. After nearly an hour of waiting, the officers returned. One of them, the taller of the two, addressed Marcus with a tone that was marginally less harsh than before. "You're free to go. No charges are being filed." Marcus stood slowly, his body tense. "No charges? So, what was all this for?" The officer shrugged. "Just following protocol." Marcus wanted to argue, to demand answers, but he knew it wouldn't make a difference. Instead, he gathered his belongings and walked away, his head held high despite the humiliation. As he exited the terminal, Marcus noticed a growing crowd of reporters outside the airport, their cameras aimed at the doors. Word of the incident had spread faster than he anticipated. He paused, debating whether to face them or slip away unnoticed. Before he could decide, one of the reporters spotted him. "Mr. Steele, can you tell us what happened on Flight 187? The questions came rapid fire, each one more pointed than the last. Marcus raised a hand, signaling for silence. "I'll speak when I'm ready," he said firmly, his voice steady despite the turmoil inside. "Right now, I need time to process." The reporters quieted, sensing the weight of his words. Marcus turned and walked toward the taxi stand, leaving the cameras and questions behind. For now. The reflection. That night, as Marcus sat in his modest living room, the events of the day replayed in his mind. He couldn't shake the feeling of being dehumanized, of being reduced to a problem that needed to be removed, rather than a person deserving of respect. His phone buzzed with messages of support from friends, family, and fellow veterans. One text stood out, though. It was from his mother, a woman who had always been his pillar of strength. "They may have tried to drag you down, but don't let them keep you there. Stand tall, son. You've faced worse and come out stronger." Marcus smiled faintly, her words stirring something inside him. He wasn't just a victim of an unjust system. He was a soldier, a fighter, and he was beginning to realize that his fight wasn't over. It was just beginning. The fight begins. Marcus Steele sat at his kitchen table, a steaming cup of coffee growing cold beside him. The house was quiet, save for the occasional buzz of his phone. Messages of support continued to pour in, texts, emails, and social media tags. But the weight of the incident loomed over him like a shadow. Despite the outpouring of sympathy, Marcus felt adrift, unsure of his next move. The video of his removal from the plane had gone viral overnight, drawing national attention. News outlets had begun to pick up the story, each adding their own spin. Some called it a case of racial profiling. Others labeled it a failure of corporate training and authority. The words "Black veteran" appeared in every headline, and while Marcus understood their significance, he couldn't shake the feeling of being reduced to a narrative he didn't fully control. That morning, as the sunlight streamed through the kitchen window, Marcus resolved to take action. He wasn't going to let this become just another viral moment lost in the noise of the internet. He had served his country, faced enemy fire, and fought for principles larger than himself. Now, it was time to fight for his dignity. And for change. Reaching out for help. Marcus began by reaching out to his old friend and fellow veteran, James "Jimmy" Carter, a man who had stood by his side during their tours in Iraq. Jimmy was no stranger to battles off the battlefield, having become a lawyer specializing in civil rights cases after his discharge. "Jimmy, I need your help," Marcus said as soon as the call connected. "Marcus," Jimmy replied, his voice steady and calm. "I saw the video. I've been waiting for your call. You okay?" Marcus exhaled slowly. "Not really. I feel like I'm fighting a battle I don't understand. This isn't just about me. It's about how people like me, people who served, people of color, are treated every day." Jimmy didn't hesitate. "You're right. This is bigger than you, but that doesn't mean you have to shoulder it alone. We'll fight this together. Let's meet and go over everything." Later that day, Marcus met Jimmy at a small office tucked away in a corner of downtown. The walls were lined with bookshelves overflowing with legal texts, and Jimmy's desk was a mess of papers and files. Despite the chaos, Jimmy exuded confidence. "First," Jimmy began, "we need to lay out all the facts. I want you to tell me everything that happened, from the moment you boarded that plane to when you walked out of the airport." Marcus recounted the events, his voice steady but laced with frustration. As he spoke, Jimmy jotted down notes, his brow furrowed in concentration. When Marcus finished, Jimmy leaned back in his chair. "This isn't just about you being removed from the plane. This is about power dynamics, racial bias, and the misuse of authority. The airline failed to de-escalate, and the police acted without cause. We can build a case." Building the case. The next few days were a whirlwind of activity. Jimmy and his legal team worked tirelessly to gather evidence. They requested security footage from the airport, reviewed passenger videos, and collected witness statements from those on the flight. Several passengers had already come forward, eager to share their accounts of what they had seen. One witness, a young mother named Elise, had been sitting just across the aisle from Marcus. She described the initial interaction between Marcus and the flight attendant. "He wasn't being rude," Elise said in her statement. "He was calm, even polite. The flight attendant seemed, I don't know, impatient, like she'd already decided he was a problem." Another passenger, an older man named Richard, provided a damning account of the flight attendant's behavior. "She escalated the situation," he said. "Instead of resolving it, she seemed determined to prove a point." These statements became the foundation of Marcus's case, highlighting the disproportionate response and the lack of justification for involving law enforcement. Jimmy also filed a formal complaint with the airline, demanding an explanation for their handling of the incident. The airline's initial response was a boilerplate apology, but as public pressure mounted, they announced an internal investigation. The police department, meanwhile, launched their own review of the officers' actions. Marcus's legal team requested records of their communications with the airline, seeking to uncover whether there had been any bias or misconduct. Public outcry. While the legal team worked behind the scenes, the public outcry continued to grow. The hashtag Justice for Marcus trended across social media, with thousands of users sharing the video and expressing their outrage. Civil rights organizations and veteran advocacy groups joined the conversation, calling for accountability and systemic change. News outlets began reaching out to Marcus for interviews, eager to give him a platform to share his side of the story. At first, Marcus was hesitant. He wasn't used to being in the spotlight, and the idea of speaking in front of millions made him uneasy. But Jimmy encouraged him to use his voice. "You have the power to shape this narrative," Jimmy said. "If you stay silent, they'll tell your story for you. Speak your truth, Marcus." With Jimmy's guidance, Marcus agreed to appear on a national news program. The interview was scheduled for prime time, and the anticipation was palpable. Speaking out. On the day of the interview, Marcus sat in the green room of the studio, his nerves threatening to get the better of him. He took a deep breath, recalling the moments in combat when fear had gripped him, and he had pushed through anyway. This was no different. He was fighting a battle, just on a different kind of battlefield. When the interview began, Marcus spoke with a quiet intensity that captivated the audience. He described the events of the flight in detail, but he also spoke about the larger issues at play. "This isn't just about me," he said. "It's about how we treat each other, how we allow biases and assumptions to dictate our actions. I served this country. I've faced danger and sacrifice, not for recognition, but because I believe in the values we stand for. But what happened to me on that plane made me question whether those values apply to everyone equally." The interviewer nodded solemnly. "What do you hope will come of this, Marcus?" Marcus paused, choosing his words carefully. "I want accountability, for the airline, for the police, for anyone who allowed this to happen. But more than that, I want change. No one should ever feel dehumanized or disrespected because of who they are." The movement grows. The interview sparked a wave of renewed support. Marcus's words resonated with people across the country, and his story became a rallying cry for those who had experienced similar injustices. Protests were organized outside the airline's headquarters, and calls for reform in law enforcement and corporate training grew louder. Veteran organizations, in particular, rallied behind Marcus, highlighting the challenges faced by those who served their country, but still encountered discrimination and disrespect. They demanded better training for airline staff and stricter protocols for involving law enforcement in non-threatening situations. Marcus, though overwhelmed by the attention, felt a sense of purpose. He was no longer just a passenger on Flight 187. He was an advocate, a voice for those who had been silenced. A new resolve. As the days turned into weeks, Marcus threw himself into the fight for justice. He worked closely with Jimmy and his team, attended rallies, and continued to speak out. The road ahead was long, and the legal battle was far from over, but Marcus was determined to see it through. For the first time since the incident, he felt a renewed sense of control. He wasn't just a victim anymore. He was a fighter, a leader, and a symbol of resilience. And he wasn't going to stop until justice was served, not just for himself, but for everyone who had ever been treated unfairly. Exposing the system. Marcus Steele found himself standing at a podium in a crowded conference room, surrounded by supporters, activists, and media personnel. The walls of the room echoed with the murmur of anticipation. Cameras flashed intermittently, their lights casting sharp shadows across the faces of the crowd. This wasn't where Marcus had imagined he'd be a few weeks ago, on a public stage, his story a symbol for something far greater than himself. Behind him stood a banner bearing the words #JusticeForMarcus, flanked by images of veterans and a montage of news headlines chronicling his ordeal. Next to him, his lawyer and friend, Jimmy Carter, stood with a confident expression, a folder of documents in his hands. The event had been organized to announce a major development in Marcus's case, a revelation that could expose the failures of multiple systems that had led to his unjust treatment on Flight 187. The internal report. A week earlier, Marcus and Jimmy had received a crucial piece of evidence in the case. After filing Freedom of Information Act (FOIA) requests and pressuring the airline for transparency, Jimmy had obtained internal communications between the flight crew and the airline's corporate office. The documents painted a damning picture. "Marcus, you're going to want to see this," Jimmy had said, sliding the folder across the desk. Marcus opened it and read the transcripts of messages exchanged between the flight attendant, Sarah Johnson, and the airline's operations team during the incident. The messages were shocking. Sarah had described Marcus as uncooperative and intimidating in her initial report to the corporate team, despite passenger accounts and video evidence showing that Marcus had remained calm throughout the encounter. The language in her messages hinted at racial bias, with phrases like "his size and demeanor make the other passengers uncomfortable," used to justify her call for security intervention. "She didn't just misinterpret the situation," Marcus said, his voice low but firm. "She framed me as a threat." Jimmy nodded. And the airline's operations team didn't question it. They approved the call for security without hesitation. "This isn't just about one person's actions, Marcus. It's about a system that allowed this to escalate without accountability." The press conference. As Marcus stood at the podium, he glanced at the crowd, steeling himself for the speech he was about to deliver. This wasn't just about clearing his name. It was about exposing the flaws in a system that had dehumanized him and countless others. Jimmy stepped forward to introduce him. "Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for being here today. What happened to Marcus Steele is not an isolated incident. It's part of a broader pattern of systemic failures that we're here to expose. Marcus has shown incredible courage in sharing his story, and today, we're revealing evidence that goes beyond personal experience. It's time for accountability." The room fell silent as Marcus approached the microphone. He took a deep breath, his gaze sweeping over the audience. "Thank you all for coming," he began, his voice steady. "When I boarded Flight 187, I was just another passenger trying to get home. I didn't expect to become the center of a national conversation. But what happened to me isn't just about one flight or one misunderstanding. It's about how systems of power can fail people, how bias, complacency, and a lack of accountability can turn ordinary situations into extraordinary injustices." He paused, letting his words sink in. "Over the past few weeks, I've relived that day over and over again. I've read the accounts, watched the videos, and worked with my legal team to uncover the truth. What we found is disturbing. Internal communications from the airline reveal a pattern of bias and negligence. I was labeled as a threat not because of my actions, but because of assumptions made about me. Assumptions rooted in my appearance, my race, and my identity as a black man." Marcus gestured toward Jimmy, who handed him a copy of the internal report. "These documents show that the decision to call security was made without question, without investigation, and without any regard for the truth. The flight attendant's words were taken at face value, and I was treated as guilty without any chance to explain or defend myself." The audience listened intently, their faces a mix of anger and determination. Marcus continued, his voice growing stronger with each sentence. "This isn't just about me. It's about every person who has ever been judged unfairly, treated unjustly, or silenced because of who they are. It's about veterans who served their country only to come home and face discrimination. It's about people of color who are disproportionately targeted by systems of authority. And it's about the passengers on that plane who saw what happened and were too afraid to speak up." The call for change. As Marcus finished his speech, Jimmy stepped forward to outline the next steps in their fight for justice. "We are filing a formal lawsuit against the airline for racial discrimination, emotional distress, and negligence," Jimmy announced, his voice resolute. "We are also calling for an independent review of their training protocols, as well as a public apology to Marcus and other passengers who have faced similar treatment." The room erupted in applause, a wave of support washing over Marcus as he stepped back from the podium. For the first time since the incident, he felt a sense of vindication, not because the fight was over, but because he was no longer fighting alone. The fallout. In the days following the press conference, the airline faced intense scrutiny. News outlets dissected the internal report, highlighting the systemic failures that had allowed the situation to escalate. Public pressure mounted, with calls for boycotts and protests outside the airline's headquarters. The airline's CEO eventually issued a public apology, acknowledging the serious errors in judgment that had occurred. "We failed Marcus Steele, and we failed our other passengers," the CEO admitted in a televised statement. "We are committed to making systemic changes to ensure this never happens again." Meanwhile, the police department's internal review found that the officers involved had violated protocols by failing to de-escalate the situation before resorting to force. Both officers were suspended, and the department announced plans to implement new training programs focused on bias and conflict resolution. A new purpose. For Marcus, the fight was far from over. While the public apology and policy changes were a step in the right direction, he knew that true justice would take time. The lawsuit was still ongoing, and the wounds from his experience would take longer to heal. But Marcus also felt a renewed sense of purpose. He began working with advocacy groups, speaking at events, and mentoring younger veterans who faced their own battles with discrimination and systemic bias. His story had become more than a cautionary tale. It was a call to action, a reminder that even in the face of injustice, resilience, and courage could create lasting change. As he walked into his next meeting with Jimmy, Marcus couldn't help but smile. For the first time in weeks, he felt like he was truly moving forward. The fight wasn't over, but he was ready for whatever came next. The storm before justice. The courtroom was packed. Reporters filled the back rows, their pens poised to capture every detail of what was set to be one of the most pivotal moments in Marcus Steele's fight for justice. The air buzzed with anticipation, the tension thick enough to cut with a knife. Marcus sat beside his attorney, Jimmy Carter, his expression calm but resolute. This wasn't just a hearing. It was a battle for accountability, transparency, and the systemic changes Marcus had been advocating for since his ordeal on Flight 187. It was the culmination of weeks of preparation, interviews, and public outcry, all leading to this moment where the airline and the police would be forced to answer for their actions. Setting the stage. The lawsuit had grown beyond what Marcus could have ever imagined. What started as a personal quest for justice had become a national conversation about race, authority, and the rights of veterans. Civil rights organizations had thrown their weight behind the case, offering resources and amplifying Marcus's voice. Prominent figures, from politicians to celebrities, publicly expressed their support. The legal team had meticulously built their case. Jimmy had obtained passenger testimonies, internal airline documents, and police reports, each piece of evidence painting a damning picture of systemic failure. Their argument was clear. Marcus had been unjustly removed from the plane due to racial bias and a complete disregard for de-escalation procedures. The airline, desperate to salvage its reputation, had assembled a high-powered legal team of its own. Their strategy was twofold: to minimize their liability by placing the blame on individual employees, and to question Marcus's narrative, hoping to sow doubt in the minds of the jury. But Marcus and Jimmy were ready. This was more than a legal battle. It was a fight for the truth. The testimonies. The courtroom fell silent as the first witness, Elise Reynolds, took the stand. Elise was the young mother who had been seated near Marcus during the flight. Her voice was steady as she recounted the events. I saw the entire interaction between Mr. Steele and the flight attendant. Elise began. He was polite and cooperative. The flight attendant seemed agitated from the start, and it was clear that her tone escalated the situation unnecessarily. The airline's attorney attempted to discredit her, suggesting that she couldn't have heard everything clearly due to the noise of the cabin. But Elise held firm. I was close enough to hear every word. Marcus didn't raise his voice or act inappropriately. The escalation came from the flight attendant. Next, Richard Bennett, the older passenger who had been seated behind Marcus, testified. His words were even more damning. The flight attendant's attitude toward Marcus was dismissive and condescending. When the officers arrived, they didn't ask questions. They just acted as though Marcus was a threat. The testimonies continued, each one reinforcing the narrative of Marcus's calm demeanor and the disproportionate response he had faced. When it was finally Marcus's turn to take the stand, the courtroom leaned in, hanging on his every word. Marcus's story. Marcus began his testimony by recounting his service in the military, emphasizing the values of respect, discipline, and integrity that had been instilled in him. He described the events of Flight 187 with a steady voice, his military composure shining through. I was simply trying to comply with the flight attendant's requests, Marcus said. I had no intention of causing a scene or delaying the flight. When I asked for clarification, it wasn't out of defiance. It was because I genuinely didn't understand what I had done wrong. The airline's attorney pressed him, attempting to paint him as confrontational. Mr. Steele, is it possible that your tone or body language could have been misinterpreted? Marcus met the attorney's gaze evenly. I suppose anything is possible, but I know how I conducted myself. I was calm, respectful, and patient. What I experienced wasn't a misunderstanding. It was a failure of the system. Jimmy followed up with questions that allowed Marcus to highlight the broader implications of the incident. What do you hope will come from this case? Jimmy asked. Marcus's voice softened, but his resolve was unshaken. I want accountability. I want change. I want people to be treated with the dignity they deserve, no matter their background, race, or status. And I want to ensure that no one else has to go through what I did. The defense's strategy. The airline's legal team focused their defense on isolating blame. They argued that the actions of Sarah Johnson, the flight attendant, were not representative of the company's values or policies. They pointed to her training records and suggested that she had acted out of personal misjudgment rather than systemic bias. Sarah herself was called to testify. She appeared nervous, her hands trembling as she answered questions. I felt like he was being uncooperative, she stammered. I didn't mean for things to escalate the way they did. But Jimmy was ready. He presented the internal communications that revealed the biased language Sarah had used to describe Marcus. You described Mr. Steele as intimidating and claimed he made other passengers uncomfortable. Can you explain why you used those words? Sarah faltered. I don't know. It was just how I felt in the moment. The courtroom buzzed with murmurs. Jimmy pressed further, showing that Sarah's actions were influenced by her own biases and that the airline's lack of oversight had allowed those biases to dictate the outcome. The verdict. After days of testimony and arguments, the case was finally in the hands of the jury. The deliberations lasted for hours, each passing minute stretching into eternity for Marcus and his team. The weight of the moment was palpable. When the jury returned, the four-person stood, holding a sheet of paper. The room fell silent. We find the defendant, the airline, liable for racial discrimination and negligence, the four-person announced. We award Mr. Steele compensatory and punitive damages and recommend a review of airline policies and training procedures. The courtroom erupted in a mixture of cheers and tears. Marcus felt a wave of relief and vindication wash over him. Justice, at least in part, had been served. The ripple effect. The verdict sent shockwaves through the airline industry and beyond. Airlines across the country began reviewing their policies, implementing mandatory bias training for employees, and revising their protocols for involving law enforcement. Advocacy groups used Marcus's case as a rallying cry for broader reforms, sparking a national conversation about racial bias and authority. Marcus, though grateful for the outcome, knew the work wasn't over. He continued to speak out, using his platform to advocate for systemic change. His story became a symbol of resilience and the power of standing up against injustice. As he left the courthouse that day, surrounded by supporters and journalists, Marcus felt a renewed sense of purpose. The fight had been long and grueling, but it was far from over. He had become more than a man seeking justice. He was a voice for those who had been silenced, a beacon of hope in the storm of inequality. And for the first time in weeks, Marcus allowed himself a small smile. This was just the beginning, the aftermath of victory. As Marcus stepped out of the courthouse, the reality of the verdict began to sink in. The crowd outside erupted in cheers, their voices echoing off the tall buildings surrounding the courthouse steps. Cameras flashed incessantly, capturing every moment of his walk down the steps alongside Jimmy Carter and the rest of his legal team. Reporters clamored for his attention, their microphones thrust toward him. "Mr. Steele, how do you feel about today's outcome? What message do you think this sends to corporations and law enforcement? Do you believe this will lead to real change?" Marcus paused, his hand raised to quiet the crowd. The chatter ceased almost instantly, all eyes and ears locked on him. "I feel relieved, but more than that, I feel hopeful," Marcus said, his voice steady yet filled with emotion. "Today's verdict isn't just a win for me. It's a win for everyone who has ever been mistreated, profiled, or dehumanized. It's a step toward accountability. But it's just that, a step. The work doesn't end here. We have to ensure that this doesn't happen again. Not to me, not to anyone." The crowd broke into applause, and Marcus continued, his voice rising above the noise. "To the veterans who've served this country and come home to face discrimination, to the people of color who've been judged unfairly, and to anyone who's ever felt powerless, know this: your voice matters. Your fight matters. And justice, though it may be slow, is possible." The reactions, the ripple effects of the verdict were immediate and far-reaching. News outlets across the country covered the story extensively, analyzing its implications and sparking heated debates about racial profiling, corporate accountability, and the treatment of veterans. Editorials praised Marcus's courage and resilience, while social media platforms were flooded with messages of support. The airline, under immense public pressure, announced a sweeping overhaul of its policies. They pledged to implement mandatory training on racial bias and de-escalation techniques for all employees. The CEO appeared in a televised statement, acknowledging the company's failures. "We failed Marcus Steele, and we failed our passengers," the CEO admitted. "We're committed to learning from this incident and ensuring that our airline becomes a model of fairness and respect." The police department involved in Marcus's removal also announced reforms, including new guidelines for responding to incidents in public spaces. The officers who had forcibly removed Marcus faced disciplinary actions, and the department committed to ongoing bias training. Veteran organizations seized on the moment, using Marcus's story to highlight the broader struggles faced by veterans, particularly those from marginalized communities. Rallies and town halls were organized nationwide, drawing attention to the need for systemic changes in both public and private institutions. Marcus's new role. For Marcus, life had taken a turn he never expected. He went from being a private citizen to a public figure almost overnight. Invitations to speak at events poured in, and he found himself at the forefront of a national movement for justice and equality. Though the attention was overwhelming at times, Marcus embraced his new role with a sense of duty. He partnered with advocacy groups to launch initiatives aimed at addressing systemic bias and supporting veterans. One such initiative, the Dignity for All campaign, focused on promoting fairness and accountability in industries where power imbalances often led to abuse. The campaign also provided resources for those who had experienced similar injustices, offering legal aid, counseling, and platforms to share their stories. Marcus became a sought-after speaker, his words resonating with audiences across the country. Whether addressing students at universities, lawmakers on Capitol Hill, or fellow veterans at rallies, his message remained clear. Change was possible, but it required courage, persistence, and collective effort. Reconnecting with the past. Despite his newfound prominence, Marcus remained grounded. He continued to live in his modest suburban home, finding solace in the small moments of normalcy. On weekends, he visited his mother, who never failed to remind him of the strength and integrity she had instilled in him. "You've made me so proud, Marcus," she said one afternoon as they sat on her porch. "But I want you to remember something. You're not just fighting for others. You're fighting for yourself too. Don't lose sight of that." Her words stayed with him, a reminder to care for his own well-being amid the demands of his advocacy work. Marcus also reconnected with his old military unit, attending reunions and events with the men and women who had been his family in some of the darkest and brightest moments of his life. Their support had been unwavering throughout his ordeal, and their camaraderie provided him with strength and clarity. A final reflection. One evening, as Marcus sat in his living room surrounded by newspaper clippings, awards, and letters of gratitude from strangers, he allowed himself a moment of quiet reflection. The journey had been grueling, filled with moments of doubt and despair, but it had also been transformative, teaching him the power of resilience and the importance of standing up for what was right. The fight for justice was far from over, but Marcus knew he had made an impact. He had turned his pain into purpose, his humiliation into hope, and in doing so, he had become a beacon for others. A reminder that even in the face of injustice, the human spirit could endure, resist, and prevail. As he looked out the window at the stars scattered across the night sky, Marcus smiled. The path ahead was uncertain, but he was ready for whatever challenges lay ahead. For now, though, he allowed himself a moment of peace. Justice had been served, and his story was far from over. The legacy of change. Months had passed since the courtroom victory that marked a turning point in Marcus Steele's life. While the public attention surrounding the case had simmered, the ripples it created continued to spread, igniting conversations and driving changes in industries far beyond the airline involved. For Marcus, the end of the lawsuit wasn't the conclusion of his journey. It was the beginning of a new chapter. Sitting at his desk in a small but bustling office in Washington, D.C., Marcus reviewed the agenda for the inaugural meeting of the Veterans for Equality and Justice Coalition, VEG. The coalition was Marcus's brainchild, a national organization aimed at addressing systemic discrimination against veterans and advocating for fair treatment in public and private institutions. Today marked its official launch. The office walls were lined with framed newspaper articles and photos from the past year. Marcus speaking at rallies, shaking hands with lawmakers, and attending community events. But the centerpiece was a single photo from his military days, showing a younger Marcus and his unit standing shoulder to shoulder in a dusty desert landscape. It was a reminder of why he had begun this fight, and who he was fighting for. The first meeting. The meeting room was filled with a diverse group of people, veterans, activists, legal experts, and community leaders, all gathered to discuss the coalition's mission and next steps. Marcus stood at the head of the table, his presence commanding yet approachable. "Thank you all for being here," he began, his voice steady. "This coalition isn't just about addressing what happened to me. It's about tackling the broader issues that affect veterans and marginalized communities every day. We're here to push for accountability, transparency, and most importantly, systemic change." The room erupted in applause, and Marcus felt a swell of pride. Over the next hour, the group discussed plans for policy advocacy, public education campaigns, and legal support for veterans who had experienced discrimination. They outlined strategies for collaborating with lawmakers and businesses to implement new standards for fairness and equity. The roadblocks ahead. While the coalition gained traction quickly, it wasn't without challenges. Many institutions resisted the push for change, dismissing the coalition's demands as unnecessary or overly ambitious. Some critics accused Marcus of exploiting his story for personal gain, a narrative amplified by certain media outlets looking to discredit him. Marcus was no stranger to resistance. Years in the military had taught him that battles worth fighting often required perseverance and grit. But this new battlefield, one of politics, public opinion, and systemic reform, tested him in ways he hadn't anticipated. Late one night, as Marcus worked on a speech for an upcoming Veterans Advocacy Conference, Jimmy Carter stopped by the office. The two men had become close friends over the past year, their bond forged in the fires of their shared fight for justice. "You're burning the midnight oil again," Jimmy said, setting a coffee cup on Marcus's desk. "You know, even soldiers need rest." Marcus chuckled but didn't look up from his notes. "Can't rest yet. Too much to do." Jimmy leaned against the desk, his tone turning serious. "You're doing incredible work, Marcus. But you can't carry this entire burden alone. Let the coalition help you. Trust the people you've brought on board." Marcus sighed, setting down his pen. "I know you're right. It's just, this fight feels personal. Like if I don't keep pushing, it'll all fall apart." Jimmy nodded. "It is personal, but it's also bigger than you now. You've built something real here. Trust it. A personal victory." Amid the demands of his advocacy work, Marcus found time to address the personal toll the incident had taken on him. Therapy sessions helped him process the humiliation, anger, and frustration he had carried since that fateful day on Flight 187. His therapist, a fellow veteran, encouraged him to view his journey not just as a fight for justice, but as a testament to his resilience and capacity for growth. Through these sessions, Marcus began to reclaim parts of himself that had been overshadowed by the public battle. He reconnected with old hobbies, spending weekends fishing at a nearby lake or tinkering with his motorcycle in the garage. He even started volunteering at a local community center, mentoring young veterans transitioning to civilian life. One day, as Marcus was leaving the community center, a young man approached him hesitantly. "Mr. Steele," he said, his voice filled with admiration, "I just wanted to thank you. Your story, it gave me the courage to speak up about some things I've been going through." Marcus was taken aback, but deeply moved. "That means a lot to me," he said, shaking the young man's hand. "Remember, your voice matters. Don't let anyone take that away from you." Building a lasting legacy. As the months turned into a year, the coalition achieved significant milestones. They successfully lobbied for the passage of the Veterans Fair Treatment Act, which mandated comprehensive bias training for industries frequently interacting with veterans, including airlines, law enforcement, and healthcare providers. The act also established a national hotline for reporting incidents of discrimination. The coalition's impact wasn't limited to policy changes. They launched a series of public service announcements highlighting the contributions and challenges of veterans, shifting the narrative from one of pity to one of respect and empowerment. They also created a scholarship fund for young veterans pursuing careers in law, public policy, or social work. For Marcus, these achievements were proof that change was possible, even in the face of immense resistance. But he knew the fight was far from over. The systems they were working to reform had been entrenched for decades, and progress would require sustained effort and vigilance. The final reflection. On the anniversary of the courtroom verdict, Marcus found himself back at the lake where he often came to clear his mind. The water was calm, its surface reflecting the golden hues of the setting sun. As he cast his fishing line, he thought about the journey that had brought him here, the pain, the triumphs, and the people who had stood by him. He thought about his mother's unwavering support, Jimmy's guidance, and the countless strangers who had reached out to share their own stories of struggle and resilience. He thought about the young man at the community center and the veterans who had marched alongside him, their voices joining his in a chorus of demand for justice. Marcus knew there would always be new battles to fight, new injustices to confront. But he also knew he wasn't alone. The coalition he had built was strong, and its work would continue long after he stepped away from the spotlight. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Marcus reeled in his line, smiling as he felt the weight of a catch. It wasn't just another fish. It was a symbol of persistence, patience, and the rewards of never giving up. He had turned a moment of humiliation into a movement of hope, and as he packed up his gear and headed home, he felt something he hadn't in a long time: peace. Closing the chapter, Marcus drove home from the lake in silence, the hum of his truck the only sound accompanying the thoughts swirling in his mind. The sunset painted the sky in hues of orange and purple, a reminder of the beauty that could still exist even after the most turbulent storms. He had fought battles both visible and unseen, and while he knew his work would never truly be over, he felt a sense of closure creeping in, a rare and welcome feeling. The celebration. A week later, the Veterans for Equality and Justice Coalition, VEJC, hosted its one-year anniversary gala in Washington, D.C. The event was a celebration of the coalition's achievements, a gathering of allies and supporters who had stood by Marcus and the cause through thick and thin. The room was filled with a sense of unity and determination, the walls adorned with banners reading, "Dignity for All, a Year of Progress." Marcus stood near the entrance, greeting guests as they arrived. Among them were veterans he had served with, community leaders, and even some of the passengers from Flight 187 who had supported him throughout his journey. Elise Reynolds, the young mother who had testified on his behalf, approached with her husband and young daughter. "Marcus," she said, her voice warm, "I just wanted to say how proud we are of you. You turned something awful into something incredible." Marcus smiled, kneeling to greet her daughter, who clutched a small drawing of a plane. "Thank you, Elise, and thank you for standing up when it mattered most." As the evening progressed, Jimmy Carter took to the stage to introduce Marcus. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice booming through the elegant ballroom. "It's not often you meet someone who takes their pain and turns it into power." Marcus Steele didn't just seek justice for himself. He lit a torch for others to follow. Let's give him the welcome he deserves. The room erupted in applause as Marcus stepped onto the stage. He took a moment to soak in the scene, his heart full. "Thank you," he began, his voice steady. "Tonight, we celebrate not just the victories we've achieved, but the community we've built. When I was dragged off that plane, I felt humiliated and powerless. But thanks to all of you, I learned that even in the darkest moments, we can find strength. Together, we've made strides I never thought possible, and we've proven that change is not just a dream. It's a reality we can create." He paused, his eyes scanning the crowd. "But this isn't the end. There's more work to do. The systems we're fighting against didn't break overnight, and they won't be fixed overnight. But I believe in this coalition, in the power of unity, and in the resilience of the human spirit. So tonight, let's celebrate what we've done and prepare for what's next." The crowd rose to their feet, clapping and cheering as Marcus stepped down. For the first time in a long while, he allowed himself to bask in the moment, the warmth of gratitude washing over him. A new chapter. As the gala ended and the guests departed, Marcus found himself alone in the quiet ballroom. Jimmy approached, a glass of champagne in hand. "You did it, Marcus," Jimmy said, clinking his glass against Marcus. "We did it," Marcus corrected, his smile faint but genuine. "I couldn't have done this without you." Jimmy laughed. "Well, I might have pushed you a little, but you were always the one steering the ship." Marcus looked around the empty room, the echoes of the evening still lingering. "You know," he said, "for the first time, I feel like I can step back a little. Let the coalition grow on its own." Jimmy nodded. "You've earned it. But knowing you, you'll never truly stop." Marcus chuckled, nodding in agreement. "Probably not." The final reflection. In the weeks that followed, Marcus transitioned into an advisory role within the coalition, focusing on mentoring young leaders and offering guidance as needed. He returned to his suburban home, spending more time with his family and finding joy in the simple pleasures he had once taken for granted. One quiet afternoon, Marcus sat on his back porch, a notebook in his lap. He had decided to write about his journey, not just the incident on Flight 187, but everything that had followed. He wanted to document the lessons he had learned, the people who had stood by him, and the power of resilience in the face of injustice. As he wrote, a gentle breeze rustled the pages, carrying with it the distant hum of the world outside, a world he had helped to change, even if just a little. Marcus paused, gazing out at the horizon. His journey had been filled with pain, but it had also been filled with purpose. He had faced humiliation and turned it into hope, endured injustice, and transformed it into a legacy of change. And though the fight for equality and dignity was far from over, Marcus knew he had left his mark. With a contented sigh, he set down his pen, the final words of his story etched in his mind. The fight for justice is never easy, but it's always worth it. And even in the darkest moments, we have the power to rise, to resist, and to make a difference. Marcus Steele, the man who had once been dragged off a plane in silence, now stood as a symbol of strength and hope, a testament to the enduring power of the human spirit. And as the sun set on another day, Marcus smiled, knowing his story was far from over. It had simply become part of something much larger than himself.